The money alone isn't going to fully fix the city of Detroit, right? People talk about ARPA funding like Detroit got infinite money. It didn't. Detroit got a temporary boost, a head start. But the real question now is what happens after the money? What systems were created? What investments become self-sustaining? What programs survive? What neighborhoods gained momentum? What opportunities attracted permanent investment? That's the conversation we should be having right now. Not just how much got spent, but what created long-term capacity. Now, with all of that said, if nearly $1 billion enters a city and residents still don't clearly understand where the impact is, that tells you communication and visibility are just as important as spending itself. Detroit received nearly $827 million in federal COVID recovery funding through ARPA, the American Rescue Plan Act. That is an absolutely historic amount of money. And yet, if you ask a lot of Detroiters right now, does your neighborhood actually feel dramatically different? A lot of people are going to hesitate. Some people are going to say, well, yes. Some people are going to say absolutely not. And that right there is the real conversation that we would like to have today, because even hundreds of millions of dollars can disappear fast when you're dealing with decades of disinvestment. So today I want to break this whole thing down from a perspective of a developer, a landlord, a business owner, somebody actively working in Detroit's neighborhoods, and also somebody who actually understands how brutally expensive it is to rebuild cities in real life, because I think both sides of this conversation are right. The city did some meaningful things with these dollars, but I also completely understand why many residents still feel like they're waiting for transformation that hasn't arrived yet. Let's get into it.
Received hundreds of millions of dollars in federal COVID recovery funding with promises of better housing, home repairs, jobs, and neighborhood improvements. Still, many are wondering what promises the city actually delivered on. CBS News Detroit's Elaine Rojas Castillo continues getting answers on where that money went and whether it worked.
Detroit received about $827 million through the American Rescue Plan Act, or ARPA, a once-in-a-generation infusion of federal money designed to help cities recover from the pandemic.
All right, first off, let's put this number into context, because people hear $827 million and immediately think Detroit should look like Dubai by now. That's not how cities work. And this is where people who've never actually developed projects or have dealt with infrastructure misunderstand scale. Do y'all realize how expensive urban real estate is? One major affordable housing project alone can cost $15 million, $30 million, sometimes $100 million plus, right? A single streetscape project can actually cost millions of dollars, right? Just one recreation center renovation, millions. Lead pipe replacement, millions. Road infrastructure, millions. And Detroit isn't starting from scratch. Detroit is starting from decades of deferred maintenance. That's the key difference. But let me slow this down, because some viewers may not fully understand what ARPA actually was. ARPA stands for the American Rescue Plan Act, and it was passed in 2021 during COVID under the Biden administration, and the goal was to try to stabilize the economy after business shutdowns, unemployment spikes, housing instability, public health costs, and municipal revenue losses, right? Cities across America received direct federal funding. Detroit got one of the largest allocations because of population size, economic distress metrics, poverty indicators, and the city's historical vulnerability. This money was not designed to permanently fix Detroit. It was emergency stabilization funding. That's important to note, because a lot of people are subconsciously evaluating ARPA like, if this didn't permanently solve poverty, then it failed. Let's be honest here. That was never a realistic outcome.
The city says that money went toward affordable housing, home repairs, youth jobs, parks, homeless services, recreation centers, and workforce development.
Now, this is where it gets complicated, because all of these categories sound great politically, but these are also some of the hardest categories to measure emotionally. Let me explain. If the city builds affordable housing, that doesn't necessarily mean your block suddenly looks different. If a family receives a home repair grant, that changes that household's life dramatically, but it may not visibly transform an entire neighborhood overnight. And this is where public perception and policy outcomes collide, because residents tend to judge impact visually. People ask, do the streets look better? Are there less vacant houses? Are businesses opening? Is crime down? Do I feel safer? Are grocery stores coming? Are schools improving? That's how humans naturally evaluate progress. But governments often evaluate success through program enrollment, grant disbursement, units created, compliance metrics, and statistical outputs. Those are very different lenses. Now, as a developer, I can tell you right now, housing is insanely expensive to build in 2026. People online still think developers are just printing money. Meanwhile, insurance costs are exploding, labor costs exploded, interest rates increased, construction materials remain elevated, and financing stacks are incredibly difficult. A lot of affordable housing projects literally do not happen without subsidies anymore. That's the uncomfortable truth. So when the city says, hey, look, they invested in affordable housing, that likely means they were helping deals become financially feasible that otherwise would have died. And most residents never see that back in reality.
City Deputy CFO Terry Daniels says some of the biggest impacts can be seen in programs that were expanded or didn't exist before ARPA funding.
This was once in a lifetime funding that has an end, but we tried to make sure that we could touch every Detroiter.
Daniel says the city has used around $745 million so far, with about $80 million that is currently being allocated ahead of the December 31st spending deadline.
Now, that once in a lifetime statement that was made is extremely important to highlight because a lot of cities across America are about to face a brutal cliff. There are a number of programs that have been launched with temporary federal money, but now that money is ending, right? And the scary question becomes, what happens when that funding disappears? Can the city sustain youth jobs, workforce programs, homelessness services, neighborhood stabilization efforts? Because temporary money creates permanent expectations. That's one of the biggest hidden dangers of federal rescue funding. Now, some cities used ARPA money strategically, right? They put the right investments in the right programs with the expectation that this would not be forever funding. Some cities also used it politically, and sometimes those overlap. So let's be honest, there's always tension between transformational investments versus politically visible investments because elected officials naturally want residents to feel results very quickly. But the projects that actually transform cities can often take 5, 10, sometimes 20 years. That's the hard truth of urban redevelopment. Let's be brutally honest here, right? Some Detroit neighborhoods have been waiting for investment for 40 plus years, right? So when people hear nearly $1 billion came into the city, they naturally expect to feel something dramatic.
Council member Denzel McCampbell, who chairs the City Council's Budget, Finance, and Audit Committee, says residents should look at what programs were actually funded and how they impacted daily life.
How has it improved their quality of life in our neighborhoods, in their cost of living, like when it comes to jobs that have been created with ARPA dollars, when it comes to adequate housing that folks may have been able to have?
How has it improved our quality of life? Now, that is the real question. Not how much money was spent, but what changed. And honestly, that's the question every city in America should be asked because government spending without measurable neighborhood outcomes creates distrust. Now, to be fair, some things did improve. Actually, in my opinion, a lot of things, including the assistance that the ARPA dollars provided for the project that I was able to develop on the east side of Detroit here. And so I really appreciated the infusion of those dollars that ultimately trickled down to me and my project in one format or another. More specifically, I went through the Detroit Means Business Initiative, which was extremely helpful in helping get some design work done at the site. But I am saying that just to be fair, because I really do feel that there were a number of improvements that ARPA dollars were able to provide the neighborhoods indirectly and directly in a number of ways. Detroit absolutely expanded housing programs, homeowner assistance, recreation investments, workforce development, and public services. But here is where I will challenge the narrative. Detroit's biggest issues are structural, and structural issues require structural solutions. Listen, you can't just fix 70 years of urban decline with a one-time federal grant. That's not pessimism, that's reality. And honestly, I think one of Detroit's biggest long-term risks is creating dependency on outside rescue funding instead of building self-sustaining economic ecosystems, because eventually grants end, right? Stimulus ends, political administrations change, and federal priorities shift. Cities ultimately survive through local business growth, tax base expansion, entrepreneurship, population retention, and private sector confidence. That's the long-term game.
Daniel says the city understands some residents may still feel their neighborhoods haven't changed enough, but says the city never expected one-time federal money to fix everything overnight.
There's still a long way to go. This money wasn't going to fix everything, but it sure gave us a really good head start.
But these are programs that are needed year-round. They're needed beyond the pandemic. And we are having those conversations and putting into effect with those budget amendments, but also with the budget that we recently passed.
Getting answers in Detroit. Elaine Rojas Castillo, CBS News Detroit.
You know, perception matters, right? Tremendously here in the city of Detroit. And neighborhood change is unfortunately uneven. Some areas in Detroit are moving extremely fast, while others still feel stuck, right? That creates emotional tension inside the city of Detroit. You can literally drive from a major development to deep abandonment within minutes. That psychological contrast impacts how people perceive progress. Let me give viewers some real context here. A lot of people think city governments directly, quote unquote, fix neighborhoods, but cities are really coordinators. Real neighborhood transformation usually requires private investment, nonprofit involvement, lenders, developers, contractors, community organizers, utilities, infrastructure agencies, and resident participation. It's an ecosystem, right? That's why redevelopment feels so slow. But the money alone isn't going to fully fix the city of Detroit, right? People talk about ARPA funding like Detroit got infinite money. It didn't. Detroit got a temporary boost, a head start. But the real question now is what happens after the money? What systems were created? What investments become self-sustaining? What programs survive? What neighborhoods gained momentum? What opportunities attracted permanent investment? That's the conversation we should be having right now. Not just how much got spent, but what created long-term capacity. Now, with all of that said, if nearly $1 billion enters a city and residents still don't clearly understand where the impact is, that tells you communication and visibility are just as important as spending itself. But Detroit is still one of the most fascinating urban experiments in America because the city is simultaneously growing in some areas, shrinking in others, revitalizing corridors, battling affordability concerns, attracting investors, and still managing deep poverty. That creates contradictions. And ARPA funding became fuel poured into an already complicated ecosystem. Some of it absolutely helped. Some of it likely got diluted by bureaucracy. Some programs probably overperformed. Some probably underperformed. That's government. But the bigger issue now is sustainability because the next chapter of Detroit will not be determined by stimulus checks. So I don't think this is a simple ARPA succeeded or ARPA failed type of scenario. I think the reality is much more nuanced. Detroit absolutely benefited from this money, but the scale of Detroit's historical challenges is so massive that even hundreds of millions of dollars only scratches the surface. And honestly, that should humble everybody, right? Politicians, developers, residents, investors, everybody, because rebuilding cities is extremely hard to do. And if Detroit really wants long-term transformation, the next phase can't just rely on rescue funding. No, it has to create systems that sustain themselves long after the federal money disappears. Question for my Detroiters: do you feel that Detroit neighborhoods changed because of ARPA funding? Did your area improve? Did you personally benefit from any programs? Or did you feel like the impact was overstated? Would love to know your thoughts in the comment section below. We also have a Patreon community. Link is in the description. We talk a little more low level about real estate development and entrepreneurship. Would love to welcome you over there as well. See you in the next video.